All right, everyone. Welcome to the weekly current events and election 2020 update. I'm Akalash.
And I'm Fatma.
And we're really excited to bring this stream to you this week. All right, so in this stream, we're going to give you some more updates about the impeachment inquiry that's happening. We're going to tie in what's happening to some AP Gov standards that you should be aware of. We're going to talk about some general domestic and international current events, maybe not all relating to politics, but things that you should be aware of. And then the 2020 election update with Fatima. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is just kind of a timeline in the impeachment of Donald Trump. If you've been paying attention to the news, this has kind of dominated political news since around September, October. So between September and November, the inquiry stage happened. So that occurred in the House of Representatives. And at the end of that, 2 articles of impeachment were passed. Finally, in the middle of January 16th, a trial began in the Senate. On January 22nd to the 24th, the prosecution made their opening arguments, and the 25th through the 28th, the defense, which is a team of attorneys appointed by the president, made their arguments. After that, there was 16 hours of question and answer, which kind of occurred over this past week. And then on January 31st, the Senate majority, so 51 Republicans, voted against allowing subpoenas to call witnesses for trial. Basically, they said, what that means is they said, we're not going to hear witnesses. So that's kind of the conclusion they came up with. The vote was strictly on party lines. And that basically kind of ends hopes for people that want the conviction of Donald Trump. So February 5th, the Senate plans to conclude the trial with the vote. It requires a 2/3 majority. It's not impossible, but at this point, it is unlikely based on the lack of evidence that has been presented due to the vote that prevented those witnesses from being heard. So first, we're going to talk a little bit more about the question and answer session. So what happened and what the procedure was that the senators had to write questions on a piece of paper addressing either team. So either the impeachment managers with the prosecution or the defense, which are Trump's team. Chief Justice Roberts, he presides over the trial. Remember, that's one of his duties as Chief Justice. He presides over the Senate impeachment trial. He's the one that had to read aloud every single question. One significant moment that kind of happened over this long question and answer session, it was almost 16 hours, I believe. He refused to read or allow a question that addressed the identity of the whistleblower who's at the center of this entire impeachment scandal. So I believe it was Rand Paul that asked a question that explicitly stated the name of the whistleblower, and Justice Roberts refused to read it. So that was just a significant event that happened during the question and answer session on January 29th, or around that time. On January 31st was the vote. That's the vote that I was talking about with the subpoenas for witnesses. They voted 49-51 to bring the impeachment trial effectively to a close. But again, we're not sure of the outcome yet. The vote, the final vote for conviction or acquittal has not actually happened yet. The senators voted to not issue subpoenas for witnesses and evidence. So one key thing that many Democrats had been advocating for was issuing a subpoena for National Security Advisor John Bolton. Democrats wanted to use his testimony and other testimony to prove their case further. However, because of the vote, which was 49-51, obviously very narrow, this did not occur. It was a partisan vote. However, 2 Republicans did break their ranks, Mitt Romney of Utah and Susan Collins of Maine. This kind of makes the path clear for the president that he will likely be acquitted. However, like I mentioned like 2 or 3 times already, we're not certain of that yet. So a lot of times you'll hear in the media and even again in this stream that it's kind of a clear path now. But again, some senators haven't said what they'll be voting. However, the key thing to remember is there needs to be a 2/3 majority in order for him to be convicted. So that's kind of the big issue that Democrats are facing, is that they're not able to secure the 2/3 majority for the president to be convicted. So what happens this week? So this should probably wrap up this week. Today, closing arguments were given by the prosecution and defense. Tuesday, kind of a setback for the White House. The Trump will give his State of the Union before the actual vote. So he can't use a platform to say he's acquitted. So he can't kind of use that as a way to publicize that he's innocent. Wednesday, finally, the Senate will vote on whether or not to convict the president. Again, like I said, a 2/3 majority is required. And in order for that to happen, 20 Republicans would have to vote with all the Democrats for the conviction. So we talk about the Republicans all needing to vote, but also there's now one Democratic senator, I believe from West Virginia, that says he's not completely sure on his vote yet. So again, all of the Democrats would need to vote for the removal of the president, as well as 20 Republicans. So that's kind of something to remember. You should know that a 2/3 majority is needed for the president to be removed. So that's something that you might be asked on a multiple choice question. Kind of seems insignificant, but they kind of expect you to know all of these little processes sometimes, such as the way impeachment works, the way an amendment to the Constitution is passed, those kinds of things. It's just good to be aware of the numbers and majorities that are needed in both houses for stuff like this to happen. So as always, we kind of like to do an AP Gov tie-in to each of the streams. As you guys know, the main purpose of these streams are not only to provide you guys with an outlook on the current events that have happened over the past week, but for you to be able to tie them into classes you're currently taking, or maybe taking in the future, such as AP Government and AP Language. So over the past few weeks, we've really tried to incorporate stuff that's straight from the standards so that you can, that will help you on the exam. So one thing that this particular standard is how public opinion is measured. So public opinion, if you can read the standard, it's measured through scientific polling, and the results of public opinion polls influence public policies and institutions. And the learning objective that's underneath it says, explain the quality and credibility of claims based on public opinion data. So a lot of times this standard will not only be tied into your multiple choice questions on the AP Government exam, but also the free response question. Your free response number 2 is a quantitative analysis question. That means that they'll normally give you a graph, table, chart, something like that, and you'll be asked to interpret it and write a response about it, connect it to some kind of political event. So obviously now at this point, a key thing in politics about graphs, charts, where that's being used is not only with 2020 election polls, but with impeachment and American public opinion on impeachment. So this standard deals specifically with public opinion and how that can influence a given election. So this example of the graph that you can see on the screen is from 538. They have a bunch of interesting graphics about anything politics related, whether that be the election, impeachment, public opinion of the president at the time, public opinion of the president over time. That's all stuff they have. So I would definitely recommend checking this out and even using this site to practice with graphs for the Quantitative Analysis FRQ. But this graph, it kind of just shows the support for impeachment by party. So obviously you can see 86% of Democrats support impeachment, 44.9% of Republicans support impeachment, and around 44.9% of independents support impeachment, and 13% of Republicans support impeachment. So obviously there's a huge divide between the Democrats, who are at 86%, and the Republicans, who are at 13%. The independents kind of are in the middle. Something that you'll see over time is that our country has become increasingly polarized. So that's probably a key term that you'd want to know, polarization. That basically is more and more division that's happening across the country with our political views. So more people are leaning farther left and more people are leaning farther right than going towards the middle. So that's something you want to remember, is that over time, our country has gotten a lot more polarized. All right, so next we're going to talk a little bit just about some key domestic events. Not all of them are politics related, but again, this really is to just inform you about what's happening. One thing is that Trump loosened restrictions on the use of landmines. They've been banned by more than 160 countries, and Obama had put some more restrictions on there, but Trump kind of loosened those Obama-era restrictions. If you guys remember from a few months ago, there was a travel ban that was instituted by President Trump. That basically, I mean, it's a huge debate, went through district and circuit courts. That travel ban was expanded to include 6 new nations. So these nations include Nigeria, Eritrea, Tanzania, Sudan, Kyrgyzstan, and Myanmar. Basically, this just imposes strict travel restrictions on those areas. Immigrant visas for people that want to live in the United States are now banned for people coming from those countries. Again, it prevents immigrants from two of those countries, Sudan and Tanzania, from moving to the United States through what's called a diversity visa lottery. I would definitely recommend looking that up. It's a really interesting way in which people can come to our country. The diversity visa lottery basically grants green cards to almost as many as 50,000 people a year. So that's really an interesting way in which people come to the United States. However, immigrants will be able to apply for waivers from these restrictions. However, the way in which to apply and the reasons that like a waiver can qualify, be accepted, they're kind of vague at this moment. What the administration has kind of put out is that they're issued to people who would experience hardship if they're denied entry. So again, that's very vague. A lot of people are very concerned. They don't know what to do now, especially if they have family that's in those countries that are wanting to come to the United States. However, we are not sure what this will entail. So probably in the next few weeks, there will be more news from the administration, from other people in politics about the actual effects of this travel ban. Additionally, something else maybe not really politics related, the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. However, something that is politics related is that President Trump and Michael Bloomberg combined spent around $21 million on national campaign ads that aired during the Super Bowl. So, I mean, you could look them up. You can see both of their ads that aired during the Super Bowl. A lot of the other candidates, Democratic candidates, aired ads that were like regional ads, so they didn't go to the entire nation. However, Trump and Bloomberg both spent that much money to put out ads to persuade people to vote for them for the upcoming election. And then last thing, some key international events. Coronavirus, I'm sure you guys have all heard of it by now, was declared a global health emergency by the World Health Organization. When I made this, it says 8 cases were currently reported in the U.S., but I believe it's gone up to 11 now. Not positive, but I think it's 11 now. I think that's changed from when I made it. The first death outside China from the coronavirus happened in the Philippines a few days ago. Another thing, kind of sports related again, the Australian Open concluded in Melbourne amid the wildfires that are going on there. Novak Djokovic and Sofia Kenin won the singles championships. And finally, something that we've kind of been hearing out for like a long time, almost I think 2 or 3 years, Britain finally formally left the European Union on January 31st. There's now a transition period through December. That transition period is basically in like a time where like minor details can be worked out, such as like who will do stuff about law enforcement, the aviation standards that will be shared, access to fishing waters, supplies of electricity and gas, regulation of medicines. A lot of these things had been regulated by the EU for Britain, but now because Britain is in the proximity of so many EU countries, this still needs to be negotiated, even though Britain has formally left the EU. So Brexit, that has happened. However, there is a transition period between now and the end of the year. So now Fatima will talk a little bit more about the 2020 election.
Okay, so in the past few weeks, we've been talking a lot about like the Democratic National Committee and like a bunch of different candidates and how they've been like doing on the debate stage or dropping out of the race because they haven't been able to meet like the thresholds needed to qualify to be on the debate stage. So this week we're going to talk a little bit about like the nitty-gritty of how the rules are changing because of the Democratic National Committee. So until now, the DNC, aka the Democratic National Committee, it was requiring candidates to meet both a polling threshold and get donations from a like set number of unique individual like donors to be able to like join in on the primary debate stage, right? And so every single time there was a new debate, like those thresholds were getting higher. So like just like recently, it was like 200,000 individual donors and like a like mix of like being able to qualify in different national polls and or like early state polls, right? But the DNC recently announced like as early as like last week in the past few days that the candidates that are currently in the race don't need to meet any donor requirements to qualify for the debate on February 19th. And so they need to do either like get 10% in 4 different qualifying national polls, 12% in 2 Nevada or South Carolina polls, or earn at least one delegate in Iowa or New Hampshire. And so this is kind of like a little bit controversial because as we'll see on the next slide, the reason why all of these like debate rules like matter and why they're changing is because it affects like how different candidates will be on like the stage, right? So specifically, like a lot of candidates that are currently in the race are speaking out against the rules because they seem to be like heavily benefiting former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg because he's refused to accept any donations because, you know, he's a billionaire, so he can completely afford to do that and like spend all of his, like not all of his money, but like millions of dollars like on his campaign, right? And he received 10% support in a national Fox News poll. And so a very significant part of that is because he like spent a huge amount, like millions of dollars we've like talked about in the past few streams on ads across the country. And so literally like personal experience here, I was eating dinner a little bit earlier and there was literally a Michael Bloomberg ad and I was like, what is happening? So that's like, it just shows like he's spending money and like not very like he's focusing on Super Tuesday, which is like when a lot of states across the country like will be voting in the primary. So it's not the early states like Iowa, New Hampshire, or like South Carolina or anything like that. But it does make up for like a very significant result when it comes to the primary elections. And so Texas votes on Super Tuesday, and that's where I'm from. So that's probably why there was an ad. But he also very significantly isn't campaigning in the first 4 primary like or caucus states. So it means that by allowing people to qualify for the debate stage by hitting polling thresholds nationwide, plus in like Nevada and states like that, it means that it's easier for Michael Bloomberg to actually qualify for the debate stage in the first place. And so the reason why this is kind of problematic and why like 9 candidates that are currently in the Democratic race protested this rule change is because in December, these 9 candidates, they asked for the rules to be changed and asked for the polling thresholds and like donors to be set a little bit lower because they were hurting specifically candidates of color. And so that was candidates like former Secretary Julian Castro, Senator Cory Booker, Representative Tulsi Gabbard, and former Governor Deval Patrick. And so all of them failed to meet the requirements in terms of qualifying for the debate. And so Andrew Yang ended up being the only non-white candidate at the debate. So that's like a huge change from like when we're looking at earlier in the race, like July, August, there were a lot of different people of color that were like remaining in the race and still being seen as like very competitive candidates. But like these polling thresholds and the individual donor thresholds that they needed to meet to qualify for debates were making it more difficult for them to actually get onto the stage, which is why those like 9 different candidates like protested the rules in December, right? And so the reason why specifically this is a little bit more controversial is because the DNC put out a statement that was like, we're not going to change the threshold for like one candidate, and they're not going to revert back to 2 consecutive nights with more than like 12 candidates. So they're pretty much saying that they didn't want to have 2 nights of debates again, and they didn't want to just like change the rules to favor one candidate, which is ironic because all of this seems like it's being done to favor Michael Bloomberg. So one of the things that like is an important discussion here is the role that money is playing in politics, right? Because a lot of discussion around this is happening specifically, and it's saying like Elizabeth Warren put out a tweet saying that people shouldn't be able to like buy elections, right? And that corruption and like you shouldn't be able to just because you're a millionaire jump into a race and like pretty much buy it. And so that's extrapolating a little bit. Like you guys can go check out her tweet if you want. But like Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden like had similar reactions. Like we shouldn't be changing all of these requirements for one person, which it kind of seems like the DNC is doing in this situation. And so now that we've covered a little bit about what the DNC is up to, let's talk about the Georgia Senate. And so in these past weeks, we've mostly been focusing on like the presidential election and like things relating to the federal election commission. But in the next few weeks, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what's happening on the state level. So specifically when we're talking about Georgia, we talked about a few streams ago that Senator Johnny Isakson, he retired at the end of 2019. So when a senator retires or passes away, or pretty much if there's like an opening in their office, the governor of that state gets to appoint someone to finish the term. So the governor of Georgia, whose name is Brian Kemp, he replaced Johnny Isakson with someone named Kelly Loeffler. And if I'm saying that wrong, feel free to correct me. But that means that even though she gets to finish out Senator Isakson's term, she's still going to have to participate in a special election in November to defend the seat. So a couple important things about her is that she hasn't held office before. And so like not even like at the local level, like not even like school board or something like state senator. She was a businesswoman and co-owner of the WNBA's Atlanta Dream office. So she's also like person who's coming from money, right? And so this wasn't a completely like a candidate that had complete consensus, because President Trump actually wanted Governor Brian Kemp to appoint Representative Doug Collins. And so he was front and center during the impeachment hearings defending President Trump. And so he like won a lot of favor with the president. And so that was kind of why President Trump was like encouraging Brian Kemp to appoint him to be like the next senator, because it would kind of set him up to actually run for that seat and become the senator, one of the senators from Georgia. So Representative Collins hasn't actually officially jumped into the race, though. It's kind of like unsure whether or not he's going to jump in. But one of the things that's like keeping him from jumping in is the fact that current Senator Loeffler said she's going to spend $20 million of her own money in the race. And so that's like a huge amount of money, especially when it comes to like being able to like hire people for your staff or put out ads or stuff, right? So like if you're starting out with like way less money than that when it comes to fundraising, you're at a pretty big disadvantage. So she said that probably in order to make sure that her seat isn't going to be like challenged by someone like significant. And so she's also trying to do that by saying that she's a pro-Second Amendment, pro-military, pro-Trump, and pro-wall candidate, because she's faced some criticisms of being like viewed as less conservative than she actually is. And so this is actually an interesting tie-in to both AP Gov and AP Lang, because fun fact, women are perceived to be more liberal on the political spectrum when they're like running for office. So like even more liberal than they are. So that's interesting. Think about that. Gender dynamics. 538, like Akhilesh was talking about earlier, actually did an interesting series on this, and it's called Why Women Run, or When Women Run, and it like kind of tackles the different ways that your gender plays into your running for office. And so they interviewed like 97 different women. It's really interesting. I would recommend all of you check it out. It's like Republicans, Democrats, people who lost elections, people who won elections, former office holders. So now that I have done that 538 plug, even though we're not sponsored, let's talk a little bit about a more serious issue. It's about immigration. And so you guys might remember like during the 2018 election and like last year especially, there was a lot of discussion around how President Trump had implemented this policy of like child separation at the border. And so people who were like coming in to like seek asylum and stuff like that were being separated from their children, and their children were pretty much being like held in cages. So the reason why that's relevant right now is a couple of different reasons, but first is because this immigrant advocacy group called RAICES announced that it had installed a bunch of different exhibitions of children covered in Mylar blankets and chain link cages throughout Iowa. And so the reason why they did that is because the Iowa caucuses are happening like literally right now. And so they wanted to like raise awareness for the fact that immigration should be like a bigger issue than it currently is in the election, right? And so like all of these installments, they're playing real recordings of like children who were kept in detention. So it's to like make sure that like immigration is at the forefront of everyone's like minds as they're like going into caucus and thinking more about it, because it's not just the Democrats who are caucusing right now. There's also like the Republican primary caucus happening in Iowa. Even though no one's talking about it, it's happening. So they want people to think about the fact that President Trump has had like these very huge efforts to stop people from being able to seek asylum and to decrease the amount of refugees that are able to like come into the country and to keep low income immigrants out of the country. And so a lot of these issues haven't been like talked about, especially within like the presidential debates. And so they want to force people to have these conversations, and the fact that like the Trump administration's immigration policies have been incredibly like inhumane. And so even though Julian Castro talked about like decriminalizing crossing the border, there hasn't been like very significant debate about it, and especially recent debates. So on that note, we're going to transition a little bit into more detail about what Akhilesh talked about earlier. So he talked about how President Trump had like been loosening these restrictions around landmines, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit more about it in terms of like how it's interacting more on the political side. And so former Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Bernie Sanders, and Senator Elizabeth Warren said they would revert back to the Obama administration's landmine policy. And so that's pretty much to like stop the like purchase of landmines and their use outside of the Korean Peninsula. And side note, the reason why the Obama administration was still using them in the Korean Peninsula was to like stop North Korea from attacking South Korea. And so they said that the reason why they're saying that is because President Trump had loosened the restrictions for their use in conflict areas. And so the reason why that's really problematic is because there have been around like 130,000 people who have like had casualties because of landmines just from 1999 to 2018. And so the majority of these people have been civilians. And so this was reported by a watchdog group called the Landmine Monitor. And so obviously you don't want people who are like not participating in a war, like civilians who are just trying to go about their day to day, to be like injured, possibly killed by landmines. And so 160 countries agreed with that sentiment. And so they signed the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty because they just didn't want civilians to be like injured, and mostly because also because soldiers also suffer like very gruesome injuries because of landmines. And so they're like a very aggressive weapon. And so the US hasn't joined this treaty yet, right? And so even though no Democrat has committed to trying to get the US to ratify the treaty, because it would take 57 votes to do so, a president could still declare that the US government would follow the policy, even if it's not like ratified, right? So like that's one of the powers of the president, being able to like change government policy. So keep that in mind for the AP test. So on that note, make sure you guys come back. Thank you so much for tuning in this week.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So on that note, bye from me and Akhilesh.
Bye, everyone.